Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. I'm Campbell Paul, and it's a real pleasure and an honour to welcome you all to today's webinar from WAIMH. It's a great honour to be able to welcome you on behalf of the board of WAIMH and the whole organisation, our executive and our office in Finland, but especially to welcome you on behalf of the amazing presenters we have today. I'm sitting here in Melbourne, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the webinar presented by and chaired by Hiram Fitzgerald from Michigan. As you know, today, the title of today's webinar is Fathers and Children's Social Behaviour Regulation, Social and Behaviour Regulation, and today Hiram's going to introduce Sarah Bergman and Alyssa Meuwissen, but unfortunately Natasha Cabrera is unwell and unable to participate. But as I say, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the webinar, and it's an introduction as well to the book, that amazing book that Hiram has edited, Handbook of Fathers and Child Development, Prenatal to Preschool, with many amazing contributions from different authors, published by Springer. So it's also an introduction to thinking about the World Congress for WAIMH, which is coming up in June this year. And at the end of the webinar, I'll talk very briefly to that as well, and there's more information on the website. So this is to get us in the mood for more sharing of professional ideas, information, clinical experience, research through the Congress, but through ongoing use of webinars and other media that we have available to us. So at this point, I'm going to sit back and hand over to Hiram Fitzgerald from Michigan. Hiram has been involved with WAIMH since its birth, and before its birth really, in the gestation through different organisations. The WAIMH organisation arose out of WAIPAD and the AIM International. So Hiram Fitzgerald, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Campbell. So I'm Hiram Fitzgerald. It's my pleasure to welcome you to WAIMH webinars on fathers and children's social development and social emotional regulation. I want to thank the WAIMH webinar committee for accepting our proposal for 2 webinars to address important issues related to fathers and early childhood development. In addition, we owe thanks to Donna Hill and Choya Kulkarni from the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital's infant mental health programs for their assistance in organizing the Zoom sessions. WAIMH webinars are initially open only to WAIMH members, but after 3 months, I don't know why it's 3 months, but after 3 months, they're able to be viewed by anybody through the WAIMH website. So please encourage non-members to check the WAIMH website in May for access to these 2 webinars, this one and next week's, and all of WAIMH's other past seminars. Today's webinar includes presentations on fathers and children's social development and emotional behavior regulation. Our presenters include Sarah Bergman on fathers and emotional availability, and Alyssa Meuwissen on fathers and children's executive functioning. As Campbell mentioned, Natasha Cabrera will not be able to present today. Research with fathers has yet to generate an overriding theoretical construct to guide systematic study of their impact on child development, especially during infancy and early childhood. Natasha Cabrera and her colleagues proposed a heuristic model informed by dynamic systems theory to guide research on fathers' involvement in child development. Their model encompasses the full diversity of family structures and dynamic relationships, from dyadic to family and adjunctive system influences that one way or another filter down to the individual child. The purpose of heuristic models is to generate a map or flowchart to guide examination of pathways in space and time that may explain or predict the effect of prior occurring events on some future outcome. So the model developed by Nat Cabrera and her colleagues was intended with 4 goals in mind. First, to organize the study of fathers in relation to child development within a transactional developmental systems framework. Second, to account for the factors that affect fathers' involvement with their children. Third, to consider the factors that mediate or moderate the pathways from father involvement to child outcomes. And fourth, to consider father characteristics and parenting behaviors as mediators or moderators of other influences on their children's development. From a developmental systems perspective, individual development is unique, probabilistic, and changing through various life course transitions, tracking predictors of current and future behaviors that may change over time, including predictors from one developmental period that may or may not express until much later in development. Such changes are captured by the developmental principles of multifinality and equifinality. Multifinality refers to the many ways to reach the same outcome, and equifinality, the same developmental pathway, can predict different outcomes. These processes reflect the diversity of developmental pathways within open systems that enable tracking both continuities and discontinuities over the life course. Diverse developmental pathways are produced in part by the intersections of genetic, epigenetic, and life course experiences that impact the individual within family relationships and broader systems transactions over the life course. To date, little attention has been given to father effects within either the risk or resilience literatures, with the exceptions of the impacts of father absence and the presence of father's substance abuse and co-related psychopathology, such as antisocial behavior and interpartner violence. Father presence, like many other aspects of family structure and function, may change over time. This webinar focuses on the first 5 years of development postpartum, an extraordinary period of biopsychosocial development and organization that prepares the developing child for the transitions that will occur from preschool to elementary age. Transitions that are so significant that Samaroff and Haidt labeled the period as the 5 to 7 shift. Because development is dynamic and transactional, things are always subject to change as family structures and functional relationships shift. Children and caregivers adapt to age-related changes. Adjunctive systems influencing individuals and families expand, and everyone in the family becomes involved in adapting to resulting change. Not only those associated with the 5 to 7 shift or other transitions, but eventually puberty and transitions associated with emerging adulthood as well. Children's social competence and ability to adaptively regulate both emotional and behavioral reactivity plays a key role with respect to negotiating the 5 to 7 shift, while engaging new peer groups and adjusting to new rules and regulations related to schooling and other outside activities. Ross Thompson's definition of emotion regulation captured the systemic challenges to emotional and behavior regulation that children encounter as their proximal world expands over the life course, when he noted that regulatory systems, quote, involve the interaction of multiple behavior systems related to emotional appraisals, goals, cognitions, and other processes that also assume activation and regulatory functions in emotional responding, unquote. Many investigators suggest that fathers play an important role in modulating the organization of children's emotional behavior regulation. To do so, at the least, fathers need to be emotionally available to their children, to craft a positive parent-child relationship, influence their social competency skills, and organize neurobiological systems involved in the development of executive functioning and stress management. We now turn to Sarah Bergman, who will be followed by Alyssa Meuwissen. They will address 2 critical areas related to biopsychosocial development and the organization of self-regulation. After their presentations, we will have time for our speakers to respond to questions from you, the viewers. Please use the chat feature on Zoom to submit your questions during their presentation. Now, Sarah, father's emotional availability.
Right, thank you, Hiram, for this brief introduction. I'm happy to start off today's webinar by giving you a summary of on what we know about fathers' emotional availability, EA, with their children. And before I start my presentation, I would like you to have a quick look at this figure, which shows rough estimates of the numbers of studies that can be found on mother-child EA and father-child EA. And as you can see here, research measuring father-child EA is still quite scarce or remains scarce compared to the wealth of studies focusing on mother-child EA. However, the body of research addressing father-child EA has been growing, especially during the last 10-15 years. And based on the existing studies, I will provide an overview about the factors which can influence father-child emotional availability and about how father-child EA affects child development. First of all, I would like to give you a definition of this construct. So what exactly is emotional availability? It originates from attachment theory and also family systems theory, and it describes the extent to which adult and child share an emotional connection and the extent to which the relationship is fulfilling and healthy. And Bergman described EA as a global way of summarizing the overall quality of the affective relationship. And compared to other constructs, EA sets a greater emphasis on the role of the emotional quality in the exchange rather than the role of behavior, and it also takes the role of covert emotions into account. EA is also based on a bidirectional or dyadic approach. So adult and child are considered as individuals, but viewed within their specific dyadic relationship as affecting one another. That means if you want to make a judgment on caregivers EA, you have to take the behavior of the child into account and vice versa. And also emotional availability is multidimensional. That means it includes various aspects of the caregiver's behavior rather than focusing on sensitivity only. And therefore, EA provides a broader picture of the interaction. It can be measured using the emotional availability scales, which consist of 6 dimensions. 4 dimensions refer to the adult's contribution to the interaction and 2 dimensions refer to the child's contribution to the interaction. And I will quickly present those 6 dimensions to you because I will refer to them throughout my talk. So the first dimension is sensitivity, which refers to the adult's ability to create a general positive and authentic emotional climate. And it refers to the adult's ability to correctly recognize the child's emotional cues and signals and to respond appropriately and promptly. The second dimension is structuring. And structuring refers to the adult's ability to adequately frame the child's activities and to provide appropriate mentoring, scaffolding, and guidance, which supports the child's autonomous attempts. Non-intrusiveness, the third one, refers to the absence of open or covert hostility on the part of the adult. Non-intrusiveness captures the absence of overly suggestive or directive or protective tendencies or overstimulation interferences, and non-hostility refers to the absence of open or covert hostility shown by the adult. And then we have the 2 child dimensions left. Responsiveness reflects the child's desire and ability to respond to the caregiver in an emotionally available way, and child involvement describes the capacity as well as the interest of the child to involve the caregiver into the child's activity while keeping also a healthy balance between these involving behaviors and age-appropriate autonomy. And now that everyone is familiar with the emotional availability scales, I will turn to the question of which factors influence fathers' emotional availability with their children. And throughout my talk, I will only focus on studies actually using the emotional availability scales. As parenting is often regarded in the literature as being multiply influenced by three major subsystems of determinants, I will present the current state of empirical research regarding father-child EA accordingly based on these three subsystems. The first one includes characteristics of the parent, in our case the father, for example, psychopathology. The second one includes characteristics of the child, such as temperament, and the third one includes characteristics of the family social context, such as support, social support, or quality of the spousal relationship, for example. And we will first have a look at father's characteristics that influence EA, but I have to warn you, although the assumption that parents' own psychological and personality characteristics affect parenting has found a lot of empirical support, also regarding mother-child emotional availability. Not much is known about how these aspects actually relate to father-child emotional availability. So far, we have some indications that paternal prenatal representations or psychological symptoms and substance use and paternal involvement could play a role for father-child emotional availability. And I will present to you the empirical findings just now. There's this recent study from Italy which investigated associations between father-child EA and prenatal representations, which were assessed in 50 fathers by analyzing parental narratives regarding the future child and the unfolding relationship with the child before the child was born. And 6 to 9 months after childbirth, the authors assessed parent-child interactions using the emotional availability scales. And as you can see in this table, the results showed a strong association, showing that integrated paternal representations were associated with higher father-child emotional availability, while not integrated paternal representations were associated with lower emotional availability. So apparently, rich and flexible and open expectations, thoughts, and fantasies regarding the child before the child is born can support fathers in developing an emotionally available relationship with their infants later in life. Another study which included a sufficient sample size and a longitudinal design and investigated various potential risk and protective factors regarding emotional availability, such as substance use, alcohol or tobacco use, self-reported bonding, depression, stress, and anxiety, assessed these predictors 8 weeks after birth of the child, and then EA was assessed when the child was 12 months old. And the results of this study indicate that besides lower socioeconomic status, also higher paternal tobacco use predicted lower father-child emotional availability. The authors suggested that tobacco use could be an indicator of difficulties in emotion regulation, which contribute to the development of tobacco addiction, but also may impede the father from connecting emotionally with the child. Contrary to the expectations of the authors, depression only predicted later parent-child emotional availability in dyadic analyses combined for mothers and fathers, because then the authors applied certain specific statistical analyses which allowed for more power, and that's why they were able to find these associations. And the same was true for parental age, which was positively associated with parent-child emotional availability. Another factor that could contribute to father-child emotional availability is paternal involvement. That means the time fathers spend with their children, absolutely or relatively to mothers. And when investigating father-child and mother-child emotional availability in children with feeding disorders, the study presented on this slide only found mothers to be more sensitive than fathers when father involvement in caregiving tasks relative to mother's involvement was low. If father's involvement was high, no difference between mothers and fathers could be observed regarding sensitivity. However, the generalizability of this finding can be put into question, as in this study, this moderation effect of paternal involvement was not found in the control group, including children without feeding disorders. And also in another study, including children with and without sleeping problems, the correlation between parental involvement and paternal sensitivity was even negative. So we need future research to not only to explore mechanisms underlying a potential association between paternal involvement and father-child emotional availability, but also to investigate potential paternal determinants of father-child EA in general. In the following, I will review characteristics of the child which have been investigated in relation to father-child EA, namely gender, age, temperament, and regulatory problems. Gender is one of the most widely investigated determinants of parenting behavior, as it is assumed that parents treat sons and daughters differently and therefore contribute to potential gender differentiated behavior, which is exhibited by their children later in life. So far, only a handful of studies investigated fathers' emotional availability with their sons and daughters, and they showed that either father of sons tended to be less sensitive or more intrusive or more hostile compared to fathers of daughters, or they reported no differences between sons and daughters regarding father-child emotional availability. So due to these inconsistencies, it would be premature to draw any conclusions regarding the effect of child gender on father-child EA. And we need more studies that explore these potential differences as well as their potential stability over time. In contrast to the results regarding the effect of child gender on father-child EA, studies investigating the association between father-child EA and child age seem to be a bit more consistent. So they report that fathers actually exhibit greater emotional availability with older children. So in cross-sectional studies, fathers show higher levels of sensitivity, structuring, and non-intrusiveness with older children compared to younger children. And also children are more responsive and involving with increasing age. And there's one study that investigated the course of sensitivity with increasing child age over time and showed an increase in sensitivity between 12 and 24 months, and after that, sensitivity seemed to stay stable until 36 months of age. So if we want to know more about the potential course over time of EA dimensions, we would need more longitudinal studies like this one, which I just have mentioned here. The next child characteristic is temperament, also a very important factor that influences parenting. However, the evidence in the EA research is scarce and also mainly focused on mother-child EA, yielding mixed findings, and as well similar inconsistencies occur for the few studies investigating father-child EA in relation to child temperament. So we have one study that reported no association between father-child EA with child temperament, and other studies that report children's fussy or difficult temperament or child negativity, which includes negative affect, but as well oppositional behavior, to be negatively correlated with father's sensitivity, structuring, and non-intrusiveness. However, due to the cross-sectional nature of the mentioned studies, we cannot draw any conclusion on the causal relationships between father's EA and child temperament. And also taken together, there is an enormous gap of research regarding the relation between child temperament and parent-child EA. The literature further shows that regulatory problems in children, such as feeding or sleeping problems, can represent a risk factor for more negative parent-child relationships or interactions. And similar results can be found in the scarce evidence, including fathers, both in the context of feeding problems as well as sleeping problems of children. So fathers of children with a feeding disorder showed lower sensitivity, structuring, and non-intrusiveness, depending on the context of the interaction. And also children with feeding disorders are less responsive and involving when interacting with their fathers. And a similar pattern can be found regarding sensitivity in the context of sleep disturbances. So children with, or fathers of children with sleep disturbances show lower sensitivity than fathers of children without these problems. And again, due to the cross-sectional design, we do not know whether actually these difficulties in children contribute to lower father-child EA, or whether low father-child EA contributes to the development of those regulatory problems in children, or if the association is even bidirectional. We now switch to the question on how father-child emotional availability might be affected by the social context, as the father-child relationship cannot be viewed isolated, but only in the broader context of other relationships, especially the spousal relationship. From research on mother-child emotional availability, we know that father presence and also maternal marital status, or also the co-parenting quality, is positively associated with mother-child emotional availability. However, it remains unclear if this would apply to fathers, vice versa. Yet what has been found in studies, including both mothers and fathers, is that there is a moderate to strong positive correlation between maternal and corresponding paternal EA dimensions. And there are several explanations for these findings. First, these positive associations could be an indicator of the overall family climate, or also emotional atmosphere in the family, or it could reflect spillover effects from one dyadic relationship to another. Second, these associations could be due to assortative mating. That means that persons choose those individuals as partners who resemble them regarding their level of emotional availability, or it could be due that obviously both parents interacted with the same children who, due to their own characteristics, trigger similar emotional exchanges with both their parents. So taken together, despite the current findings on these associations, we still lack knowledge on how emotional availability in father-child relationships relate to the quality of other family relationships and on the processes underlying these associations. The last potential determinant which I would like to present is socioeconomic status, which appears to be a relevant factor influencing mother-child emotional availability. However, the association of socioeconomic status with father-child emotional availability seems less clear. Either studies find socioeconomic status or proxies such as education to be positively associated with emotional availability, for example, with sensitivity, or they report no association. And that's why, again, we need future research to explore whether or not actually socioeconomic status influences father-child emotional availability. And in general, we need more research investigating potential risk and protective factors for father-child EA, as yes, and this is especially important as we know that fathers significantly impact their children's development, often independently from mothers' influence on child outcomes. However, studies investigating if and how father-child emotional availability affects child development remain scarce. We have some indication that father-child EA affects the aspects that you can see on the right: attachment, development, psychological symptoms, and self-regulation. And again, I'm going to present the evidence to you. So the study from Italy, which I have already presented to you, and which assessed the association between prenatal representations and father-child EA, this study also showed that higher emotional availability at 6 to 9 months after childbirth predicted secure attachment of children to their fathers, assessed with the strange situation procedure at 14 to 18 months, even when paternal attachment and prenatal representations were taken into account. Another study in Australia that also used a longitudinal design to investigate the effect of father sensitivity, structuring, non-intrusiveness, and non-hostility, assessed at 12 months, and various aspects of child development at 24 months provided some evidence regarding the effect of EA on these aspects. The figure that you can see here that shows the associations between father's EA dimensions and child development adjusted for social risk, birth group, meaning full term or very preterm birth, and child sex. And the horizontal lines represent confidence intervals. Confidence intervals crossing the vertical line at 0 are not statistically significant. Horizontal lines on the right side of the vertical line represent positive associations, and on the left side, negative associations. And now you are able to see that the study demonstrated that high paternal sensitivity as well as high structuring predicted greater child language development. A high level of structuring also predicted greater child cognitive development and also greater paternal intrusiveness, that means lower non-intrusiveness, predicted a greater extent of child externalizing symptoms. However, no effect of father's EA on other domains of child development were found in this study. But this study is the first one actually highlighting the role of different paternal emotional availability dimensions for different aspects of child development, and the results need to be replicated in future research. It will also be of interest how the different paternal EA dimensions would affect different aspects of time development, of child development in their course over time. And there's one study that actually implies that different dimensions of emotional availability contribute differently to the course of child development. And in this study, the effect of sensitivity and intrusiveness, which is inversely coded non-intrusiveness, on the course of inhibitory control in children over 4 years, or was investigated over 4 years. And these figures show growth curves for inhibitory control, for sensitivity and intrusiveness for both mothers and fathers, as results did not differ between both parents. And as you can see on the left, higher sensitivity in blue was associated with a higher initial level of children's inhibitory control compared to lower sensitivity in yellow. However, there was no effect of sensitivity on the growth of inhibitory control over time, as indicated as the two lines are parallel. So that means that children with relatively sensitive parents consistently showed higher levels of inhibitory control compared to children with relatively insensitive parents, but the rate of change did not differ. And on the right, as you can see over there, intrusiveness was not related to the initial level of inhibitory control, but higher intrusiveness in blue predicted a slower increase in children's inhibitory control over time compared to lower intrusiveness in yellow. So children of relatively intrusive parents did not differ in the initial level of inhibitory control, but they did show a slower rate of growth compared to children of less intrusive parents. This study offers a broader picture on how different dimensions of EA contribute to child development over time. And if we want to gain a similarly clear or more complete picture of how EA contributes to child development, we need more longitudinal studies with sufficient sample sizes. And having said that, I think my presentation made clear that there are still a lot of open questions and much to learn about father-child EA, and maybe the studies that I presented can provide some ideas for future research regarding father-child EA in order to fill the existing gap. And so far, there are inconsistent results and a lack of studies regarding determinants of father-child EA, and also a lack of studies investigating the effect of father-child EA on different domains of child development, also over time. So there's also a need to replicate existing results, and no conclusions regarding the causality of effects can be drawn due to the cross-sectional nature of most studies. So we need longitudinal or intervention studies instead of these cross-sectional studies. And also the research mainly included fathers from Western countries and middle-class families. So it would be interesting to extend the research to other cultures and groups of fathers as well. Thank you very much for your attention. And now Dr. Alyssa Meuwissen will present findings related to fathers and children's executive functioning.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Okay, great. So my chapter covered fathers and children's executive function. And executive function, to give a definition, is a broad umbrella term for higher level thinking skills that enable children and adults to control their own behavior, to pursue long-term goals instead of to do what is automatic or easiest. And it encompasses skills such as working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, and can be talked about in terms of either cool or like non-emotional situations, or hot situations that require more of that emotional regulation piece as well. And early childhood, between the ages of 2 and 5, has been considered a period of rapid development of executive function, and it correlates in development, and we know that the prefrontal cortex is really rapidly developing in that time. And this development in early childhood of executive function is also seen as really foundational for building skills across the lifespan. Early childhood executive function has predicted academic outcomes, social emotional outcomes, and economic outcomes into adulthood. And so this has really been agreed upon that it's important to understand how to promote children's executive function in this early childhood period. And thus, there's been a lot of research investigating how the quality of parenting relates to children's executive function. And that's been rapidly increasing because, again, people really want to know about the causal antecedents. How can we help children build a foundation of good executive function so that they have those cascading positive effects across the lifespan? However, just like Sarah was talking about with emotional variability, fathers and father figures have rarely been included in this research. And bioecological theory suggests that these fathers should have both direct and indirect effects as part of the microsystem on child development outcomes. So to take a broad look at why would parenting specifically impact children's executive function skills, 3 different theories have made proposals about why there might be a link. So the first is attachment theory. And attachment theory proposes that a sensitive attachment figure becomes a prototype for children's self-regulation. And so that attachment figure allows children to kind of cycle through that secure base and safe haven behavior, where they go out and they, see excitement, they have exploration, and then they're able to come back and be comforted and regulated. And infants, very young infants, rely completely on their caregivers to provide that regulation. And then as children grow into early childhood, they're able to take more of that over themselves. And that secure base behavior has been thought to be important for children's cognitive development, because having confidence in your caregiver means that you have cognitive resources that are free to explore your environment, instead of having to kind of anxiously monitor your caregiver and use up a lot of your cognitive resources on that relationship. So attachment theory has really focused a lot on sensitive and responsive parenting as a parent who's able to be responsive to the child and meet their needs, thus allows for better self-regulation development. The second theory is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. And he proposed that adult-child interactions are gradually internalized, and that the mental processes that a child first does with a more competent partner then become kind of reorganized and taken into the child. And the parent behavior that Vygotsky focused on was scaffolding. And that is a term that he defines as just meeting a child at the border of what they can and can't do. So letting the child do all they can do, and then having that adult be there to help them kind of reach the next level of success that they wouldn't be able to do with their own skills. And self-determination theory is a third theory that also focuses a lot on similar parenting behaviors. So autonomy support is a group of behaviors that includes meeting the child exactly where they're at and letting them do all they can do and not being too controlling, not taking over the task, but not being too laissez-faire, not letting the child struggle. And so self-determination theory proposes that autonomy is one of the three universal needs that people have, and that supports motivation and well-being. And autonomy supportive parenting is the strongest predictor in their theory of positive child development outcomes. So these theories share in common that they think children learn from dyadic interactions and that they gradually internalize to achieve self-regulation. And with mothers, there's been substantial evidence that there is a non-trivial relationship between these parenting dimensions of autonomy, support, and sensitivity and child executive function. And that's been done in many studies, in large-scale studies, in studies with diverse samples, and meta-analyses show that there really is a strong or a substantial link between those types of parenting and child executive function. But the research on fathers, attachment theory did recognize fathers as secondary attachment figures, but has not researched them nearly to the extent that it has researched mother-child relationships. And then the other two theories were not very specific to what adult studies have been done with teachers, studies have been done with people other than mothers, but again, fathers have been rarely focused on, and there's not a lot of studies. And then just to note that newer neurological research looking at brain development has found that executive function is transferred from parent to child through both genetic and environmental processes, and that this extended period of plasticity in this age of 2 to 5 of prefrontal cortex and these regulatory processes might indicate that they're even more sensitive than some other cognitive processes to that caregiving environment. So in my chapter, I organized the research on father parenting and child executive function around 4 main themes. And these themes came out of work that Dr. Cabrera and colleagues had proposed. And so the first theme I looked at is that fathers have similar impacts to mothers. The second theme was that fathers have unique roles and impacts. The third theme was that the quantity of father involvement, or the amount of time they spend with the children, is important. And the fourth theme was that fathers have impacts through the entire family system. So I'll go through each of these themes and talk a little bit about the kind of broad theory of why this would matter, and then whatever empirical support we have of that theme. So the first one is that individual variation in fathering affects children's outcomes in similar ways to mothers. And so research has shown that fathers do vary on dimensions such as autonomy, support, and sensitivity in similar ways to mothers, and that mean differences between fathers and mothers are usually negligible and not significant. And so there is growing support of this theme that father autonomy, support, and sensitivity impacts children's executive function. Father sensitive and responsive parenting in toddlerhood has predicted executive function. Father autonomy, support in preschool has been linked to later to concurrent and later executive function, and self-report of these types of parenting behaviors has also been linked to early childhood executive function. And many of these studies were done with fairly rigorous methods, measuring children's executive function in lab tasks. And so while there aren't a large number of studies, they've been in fair agreement, and this is sort of a growing body of evidence that father parenting in these dimensions functions fairly similarly to mother parenting. The second theme is that fathers provide unique experiences, especially in play. And so a number of theorists have looked at father-child play as a key marker of relationships. And there's been thought that it is that rough and tumble play, or that vigorous and state-disrupting play, that is really a good marker of those relationships. And in terms of executive function, it's potentially that high arousal situations provides children really good practice for regulating behavior. And so it's possible that more so with fathers, children have to regulate their emotions or their behavior in order to continue this play that's kind of exciting and vigorous. And high quality rough and tumble play has been associated with broad children's development outcomes, such as social emotional outcomes specifically, but the research is pretty scarce on executive function outcomes specifically. So we conducted one study where we looked at father overstimulation in gym play. And so that was where fathers were pushing children to do things that the children seemed uncomfortable with or were scared to do. And so kind of not being very sensitive to their children was negatively correlated with a school readiness composite, which included executive function measures. And interestingly, in that same lab visit, we also had fathers and children do a puzzle task, kind of a more conventional autonomy support task, and that did not correlate with that school readiness composite. And so there's like a suggestion there that the rough and tumble context may have been more predictive than the kind of seated puzzle task, but there has not been very much research on this. And another caveat to make about research on father rough and tumble play is that it has not really been researched with mothers. And so it's hard to say that it's actually a unique context with fathers, because mothers do engage in some physical play, rough and tumble play, but it has not been well researched. The third theme is that the quantity or amount of involvement is important. And it's been proposed that interaction with different parenting styles may promote mental flexibility. And so if you spend some time with your mom and sometimes some time with your dad, you might have different rules or different expectations, and that might help you kind of develop more flexibility in your cognition. And another thing that's often proposed is when studies find that correlations between mother behavior and child outcomes is stronger than correlations between father behavior and child outcomes. It's often written that it may be because fathers spend less time with their children. However, it's very rarely been looked at in the same study how father involvement mediates or moderates impacts of father parenting. And so that's also just sort of like an open question at this point. Father involvement has been linked to multiple, again, general developmental outcomes, such as cognitive, social, and behavioral outcomes. And as was mentioned in the introductory comments, father presence or absence has been one piece of fathering that has been researched a little more. And so it is true that involvement in fathers is found to be promoting of child's development. However, there is this has not been looked at specifically with executive function outcomes. And in one study, father involvement was positively correlated with autonomy support, and they also measured executive function in that study, but father involvement was not directly correlated with children's executive function. And so there's still a lot to learn about how the quantity of involvement might interact with the quality and directly affect executive function outcomes as well. And then finally, the fourth theme is that fathers have interdependent effects on the family system. And so a lot of systems theories suggest that the network of caregiving relationships act collectively to impact children's outcomes. And we also know that children's behavior shapes parents' behavior, both mothers and fathers, and that has been found with children's executive function as well. We know that children's executive function can predict parents' later behavior. Co-parenting is one of these family system variables that has been researched more broadly and has been found to be related to psychological adjustment and academic outcomes for children. I could find one study that looked at quality of co-parenting in linking it to executive function outcomes, and they found that higher quality co-parenting was related to better emotion regulation during a frustrating lab task. So overall, looking at these themes, the first theme that fathers have similar effects to mothers is having kind of growing support. And then the other three themes are still very under-researched. And so it really provides some interesting lines of research that would be helpful to understand how and in what contexts fathers have an impact on their children, on their executive function specifically. Families facing risks and challenges is also an important context to look at this. We know that children in lower SES contexts are at risk for lower executive function, and that SES, parenting quality, and executive function have all been interrelated. And we also know that father involvement is more likely to be low in low SES and in high stress contexts. And so it may be that father involvement is a risk factor for children's executive function and part of that cumulative risk. We also know that maternal parenting predicts children's executive function across socioeconomic statuses and controlling for. And some research suggests that mother parenting could be a buffer between those kind of cumulative risk factors and children's executive function. And so if that's true, it seems like father parenting might be another really important way to leverage positive development and resilience in executive function skills in lower SES contexts. So there's been just a couple studies looking at fathers and children's executive function in these types of samples. And father parenting uniquely predicted emotional regulation figures, and that study users who were in, fathers or any male figure that was involved across a child's early childhood period. And so that was a interesting way to kind of overcome some of those barriers of fathers going in and out in longitudinal studies. And so they just took any father figure who was present during that time. And that also predicted children's executive function lab tasks. And so this does suggest that potentially father parenting is another aspect that we're missing in many studies, and that it could be a target of intervention as well, that if we can promote positive father parenting, we may be able to promote children's executive function across contexts. So to kind of continue on that theme around interventions, all the studies that I reviewed in this chapter were either correlation or longitudinal studies. And these cannot rule out confounding variables, especially around genetics. However, we do know that there are a wide variety of interventions that can promote children's executive function, including interventions with mothers. And we also know that parenting, both sensitivity and autonomy support and dimensions such as that, are responsive to interventions as well. There is evidence that interventions on father parenting have impacts on broad child development, but this hasn't been looked at with executive function, and often there's a lack of robust evaluation for interventions that do include fathers. And systems theory suggests that including both mothers and fathers might be the most effective way to leverage that whole caregiving environment to promote specific children's skills. So, as I mentioned, this study, this review has brought up multiple future directions for work. We should continue to replicate and extend what we know about mother parenting to father parenting. We should consider contexts and processes such as physical play that might be specifically relevant to fathers. We should measure both the amount of involvement and the quality of father parenting in the same study so that we can work on disentangling the effects and see how they interact with each other. And then I think it's really important to include mothers and fathers of the same children so that we can start to examine more of those system level effects, and that whole family system that does impact the child. And then it's always important to include more diverse samples and causal designs to continue to better understand these processes. So in conclusion, there is some growing evidence that father parenting is related to early childhood executive function, but there's still a lot to be learned. And by pursuing these lines of research, we can hope to learn more about how we could leverage father parenting and high quality father parenting to support children's executive function and thus their long-term success. So, thank you.
Do we have any questions from the viewers, Campbell?
I don't have any questions that I can see. I'm not sure whether the Q&As has been open and receiving questions, but nothing's popped up there. But we can have a bit of a panel discussion. And people in the audience are very welcome to chip in, certainly through the open question, or we can make the open chat so make the chat open to everyone if we can do that at the moment, Donna.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Each of you talked about fathers, appropriately so, in the context of a family system. What if the family system is just one of the 2.6 million single father families in the United States, and there is no mom? And or what about mom's 8.9 million single parent mothers in the United States? I don't know Germany and other places, but so how does this? What? Just talk a little bit about what you think is missing in the child's development under those circumstances, given that there might be other caregivers in those single parent homes as well, other than a married partner.
Sure, I can give my thoughts on that. I think in some ways, kind of that first theme, that it's not very dependent on specific gender, high quality parenting, any caregiving figure, whether that's biologically related, whether it's male or female, I think can support children's development kind of regardless. And so sometimes I think there's too much attention to specifically if it's a mother or father missing. However, I do think that there is a piece potentially of that diversity of stimulation, that by having two caregivers who you live with provides just variety for the child. Again, that like potential cognitive flexibility. And then I also think it provides support for the other parent. And so single parents potentially, have more stress or less help when dealing with stressful situations. We know that can impact their children. And so I think that those would be, when you ask like what was missing, I think it's the support for the parents to support each other, and then some of that just variety or getting different perspectives for the child.
There's a question from Ella Lovett about the smoking data. She's after a little more information about what that might suggest and where that data is taking us. Any comment? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the authors, they just ask parents, fathers and mothers, they just collect the data on tobacco use, yes. And surprisingly, surprisingly, they found this effect, but did not find any other effect of depression or anxiety, I think it was, that could indicate emotion dysregulation in the same way. So it is a bit surprising. Maybe it could also be some associations between tobacco use and socioeconomic status that kind of captured some of the variance or some part of the effect on socioeconomic status. But yeah, otherwise it was surprising, I think. At least, I'm not an expert regarding substance use, but haven't come across those kind of results apart from the study so often. Yeah.
Yes, presumably smoking will have other associations with alcohol and other drug use, I guess, too. And that will have been something that's changed over the last generation. The prevalence and type of smoking behaviour, I guess, tobacco smoking behaviour will have changed a bit too. Actually, just thinking of the impact of broader social events, I wonder what research there'll be coming out of the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on parent-child relationships. I know anecdotally in our country, where we've had quite prolonged and severe lockdown, there's quite a few anecdotal reports of parents saying it's been really good. As the dad says, I've been home working from home. I've got to know my child in a way I never knew them before. It'll be interesting to see. And on the other hand, we've got reports of very high prevalence of family violence. So whether those two will balance out, it'd be interesting to study them, those sort of dimensions, extremes, if you like, independently as well. You know, has it brought families that were very vulnerable? The father was on the outer. Has it brought the father into the, you know, and what are the other factors that might have seen a positive or a negative outcome because of COVID? In our context, we haven't had the prevalence of sort of death and high rates of hospitalisation and really very frightening things on our actual doorstep. So that might be different in Italy, for example, or Germany. So you need to be, I imagine one needs to be careful of looking at the pandemic having a sort of a uniform effect on cultures. But some questions. Yeah, there's a good question there, which is from Colleen Paul. I'm not sure a relation of mine or not, but I was also thinking that I'd be really interested to hear, Sarah, Alyssa, what your sort of research passion is at the moment and in this area too. So is it possible to get some of the research references from your own work? So did you want to comment on that at the moment, Alyssa or Sarah, or hi too? What's your own?
Everything that was in my introduction, there's an additional page of the PowerPoint that has all the citations there.
Yep.
So I assume that'll be available through WAIMH.
Yep. And Maria Potts. Yeah, go on. Who's that?
Yeah, I'm
Alyssa.
happy to share my PowerPoint as well, which has references.
Yep.
So yeah, sure.
What's been your particular passion in the research that you're doing in respect of fathers and infants, presumably around executive function and so forth? But
yeah, so my kind of latest is looking more at interventions with fathers and mothers and what parenting dimensions are susceptible to intervention and how will that causally impact children's executive function. So that's been my most recent work.
thanks.
There's an interesting comment by Maria Posey. Do you have that, Campbell?
Yeah, from London. Yeah, so Maria's reflecting in families with only one parent, even if that parent can embody both maternal and paternal qualities, the child isn't helped in dealing with aspects of triangular relationships, with exclusion, rivalry, and possessiveness, etc. So it sounds like Maria's suggesting the importance of actually having two parents and two parenting, gendered parenting styles embodied in the one parent might not take the child through these issues of managing triangular relationships and feeling excluded and rivalry and so forth. Any comments on that? Can a single parent embody all that's required for development? I suppose is that the
it's a little
the challenge.
Yeah, it's a little difficult for a child to understand how two people can work their way through an argument if they're just arguing with themselves.
Yes. Well, I suppose a good actor can do that, but your average mum and dad, it's pretty hard to take two points of view at once, or alternately. You're right.
You know, apropos of the comment Alyssa made a little earlier, and the smoking as well. Next week, Stephanie Godlewski will talk a bit about substance abuse. So I'm not going to say anything about what she's going to talk about, but
Yeah.
in our longitudinal study of children at risk for alcoholism and co-related psychopathology, our sample was a very specific population selected of very high risk families. Most of the data we heard today is about not very high-risk families.
Yeah.
Sort of like a broad range of kinds of average families. But what does emotional availability have to do with the first 5 years of life if you're living with an alcoholic father who is also antisocial personality disordered, and his wife probably suffers at least a lot of depressive symptoms, and they fight a lot?
Yeah.
So, Sarah, how's the emotional availability enter into that child's life?
Yeah, actually, including fathers, there's not much research around. As you said, we focus on middle class families, usually, at least including fathers. Including mothers, there are some more studies around regarding emotional availability with high-risk samples as well. And obviously, then low emotional availability predicts, yeah, bad, I mean, unfavorable child outcomes. So that's clear. However, I mean, there are also some studies around showing that interventive studies can be helpful to improve emotional availability and therefore also improve child outcomes. However, we don't know how these intervention programs would work for fathers, because actually fathers, at least in the emotional availability field of research, are not specifically included in interventional studies. So this is also quite a gap of research there.
See, Donna, go ahead.
I had another question for Alyssa, actually. When you talked about the, you said the question, how does it relate to, here's my question. How does autonomy theory relate to child development in cultures where parenting does not stress autonomy, but more communal family relatedness issues, like many cultures in the world? I think, you know, one of the, Sarah mentioned something about, you know, we need to have more cultures involved with human development. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is an interesting question. The self-determination theory has proposed that autonomy is a universal need, and that no matter what the culture, it might look different in different cultures, but all children, you know, will thrive more when they have some opportunities for autonomy. But I've also, seen other criticisms that is a fairly Western view, that to really, you know, have autonomy be as one primary need. And so I think, and even within kind of subcultures within the United States, we know that different groups feel, you know, differently about autonomy and promote it differently, and that in some, there have been studies showing that lower autonomy support is not necessarily detrimental in cultures where children don't expect or they aren't seeking as much autonomy. And so I think number one, it is likely to vary across cultures. And I think number two, like a lot of research, it really depends on responsiveness to the child, and that like we can't necessarily expect to be able to measure things in one way, but there might be commonalities where if the child feels that their needs are met, that's going to be better for them than if they really feel like they're kind of struggling against their parent. So I don't have a very definitive answer, but I think it's important to consider. Yeah.
So I was reading a paper the other day from Brazil, and it had to do with this issue. You can have autonomy embedded in independence, or you can have autonomy embedded within familialism. So your autonomy is part of the family kind of thing, as opposed to me, independent of you.
Say that again. Hi, the bit before your last sentence.
Sorry?
Could you just say that again? Yeah.
Well,
Embedding.
you can be encouraged to be an autonomous person, but your autonomy is always connected to the family.
Yeah.
Family issues, family culture.
Yeah.
Or you can be encouraged to be autonomous and truly independent. Stand on your own, as opposed to stand with us. Okay, so much of Western research, which means much of all research in human development, is from cultures where autonomy and independence tend to be the value underlying parenting. As opposed to, say, more Latinx cultures and some other cultures where your autonomy is just part of the family network. So yes, you're autonomous, but your autonomy and meaning is embedded within the family.
Yeah. Certainly that's an issue through a good bit of Asia, I guess, too, at least in terms of cultural stereotypes or understandings. Your place within the family is crucial.
I see no more questions, so I have another one.
Yeah, go ahead.
For Alyssa and Sarah. Father sons and father daughters. This is not an issue that is in the literature as much as it should be, given increasing knowledge about the vulnerabilities of males, and thus boys, to endemic stress and untoward life experiences during the first 5 years postnatally, in contrast to girls, especially with respect to the development of aggression and violence and things like that. But so, what do your literatures, the two literatures, suggest with father-son, father-daughter? You mentioned a little bit about that without mentioning sex differences, when you said fathers become more involved with their kids as they move towards preschool, right? That was emotional availability, 36 months. And then in terms of father-child interaction itself, rough and tumble play, that's not with babies. That begins to occur and emerge during the preschool years and stuff. So, and do you see differences between father-sons and father-daughters in that regard for each of you?
As I think I said in my presentation or presented to you the results regarding child gender differences, and we can actually see, or at least the research that is around regarding this topic suggests that actually fathers are less emotionally available with their sons compared to their daughters, and this is what the literature suggests so far. As to, I mean, the reasons why remain unclear, and also whether this difference would actually affect boys in their development is also unclear. So this is just the yeah.
Do you think there might be a problem with emotional availability scale assessment tool in that respect? Because I imagine it was developed particularly around mothers and not around fathers. So we might need to look at different dimensions of behaviour for fathers and baby sons and toddler sons than we've got built into the tools.
That's a very important point, because that actually is the problem with most of the assessments that we have. That most of them were originally developed for assessing mother-child relationships and not father-child relationships. And there are some approaches regarding challenging behavior or the activation relationship, which try to cover behavior that is specifically attributed to fathers. But again, I think that brings us back what Hiram said at the beginning of this panel discussion, is actually whether it is important who shows this kind of behavior or this kind of gender attributed behavior, or I mean, is it important if it comes from mothers, or if it's shown by mothers or fathers, or is it actually just important that children experience some different kind of interactions? Yes, but as I said, we don't know whether actually these differences in emotional availability would have an effect on boys' development later in life.
Yeah, I would say fairly similar from my research. There's so few studies, and I don't think very many of them at all have looked very specifically into gender differences. The few things that I can remember seeing would be that fathers tend to be a little more autonomy supportive with their sons, or that there's not much difference. So again, I don't think anyone's kind of followed that through line of like, and is it affecting their executive function? But I think, yeah, there's either little to no difference, or fathers are a bit more autonomy supportive with their sons than with their daughters.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that obviously some studies did not find gender differences. So we have inconsistencies in results, but some find differences, and some suggest that fathers show less emotional availability with boys.
Dr. Fernandez has asked, I wonder if it's more important to consider research into caregivers rather than fathers or mothers, given the changes in what's currently considered a typical or normal family unit and the members of this unit. Suggesting that there's been a big change in the way we conceptualize the family unit. Maybe that's certainly culturally related. Any comments?
I think Kevin Nugent also brought up the issue of grandparents, I think.
Yeah, let's see that.
Yeah, I think in terms of using a family systems, I think that's very correct, that it's whatever caregivers are in the system that are likely to have an impact, and that research on mothers tends to be very exclusionary. And something I've noticed is that a lot of research articles are titled something about parents and then only include mothers. And so, like, in some ways I can completely agree that whatever caregivers are in that system should be included, and we shouldn't take like one member as representative of the entire system. However, it also actually makes me wonder, just in terms of practical research, if we say like it doesn't matter if it's a mother or father, I think we're going to get a lot more mothers. And so there's also potentially value in research to be specific about focusing on fathers, because otherwise I think they tend to get lost, not even intentionally. Like, I think mothers just are more likely to sign up for research. They're more likely to come to research. And it's not that I haven't been able to recruit fathers, but it's about, we have to contact about 60% more fathers than mothers to get an equal number to come into the lab. And so, yeah, I think it's a both and. It's totally like, it only makes sense to include whoever is a caregiver in that family system. But also, if we are not intentional about including fathers, I think it's easy for them to get lost in the shuffle.
Yes, I would agree. We had the same experiences in our studies, that if you contact fathers specifically, they tend to get lost, as you said. Yeah.
Require more vigorous outreach to include them in the research. There's one comment there, yeah.
I just want to quickly comment on the question, how does couple conflict affect father EA? And as I said, we just have research regarding mother-child EA, regarding support and co-parenting quality, showing positive association, but we don't have anything in the EA research regarding conflict and father-child EA. at least not as I'm aware of. Yeah.
I was just thinking of parental depression in the postnatal period and perinatal period, and high prevalence, depending on how you define that, but certainly high prevalence in many communities. But one of the things that Carlin Lyons Ruth has noted in her work out of Boston and is a component of parental depression in the perinatal period that we often overlook is the one of irritability and anger management for the depressed or anxious parent. And I wonder, in the research that's done, how other studies that have included an assessment of parent emotional regulatory problems that go into the clinical range, and how do we build that into our research? Does that make sense? I mean, a lot of this, it sounds like a lot of these studies are community samples rather than clinical samples. If we move to look at clinical samples, I think one of the things we often overlook when we're looking at parental stress, mental health disorders, depression, anxiety in the postnatal period, we often don't look at irritability and aggression. We look at sadness and lowered mood, but irritability and aggression will be something that the infants perceive, I think, on the receiving end, both from the mothers, but also the fathers. So I'm mixing a number of things into that question, I guess.
Yeah, there are actually several studies, but I think they are also community-based studies, particularly in Brazil and in Portugal.
Yeah.
Where mothers with postpartum depression that persists. In these studies, they've shown that fathers begin to increase their parenting interactions as a buffer against the mother. But it only seems well, we don't know in these studies because they only go so far. Somewhere around 3 years of age, so the father seems to get tired of that. So, so we're not sure whether it persists beyond that. But there is some evidence that even in these community samples with postnatal depression, fathers come to the fore. And sort of take up some of the social interactive work with babies to help sort of,
to support the infant.
Those are low income samples too.
Yeah.
Studies. And what about just earlier today read one of the findings from the adolescent brain longitudinal study in the United States. About 13,000 children and their moms involved with that study. In low SES, one of the major variables that's assessed in the adolescent brain study is fMRI scans. And they found in areas that are important for executive functioning, kids in very low SES living environments tend to have structural differences relative to kids who are in more higher SES samples. So if we're looking at father and mother effects, and we don't look at broader systems effects, we might be losing some of the information that's vital.
Because part of that might be the other structures around children, like high quality daycare. How does that impact on these families who are under significant stress, if they don't have access to that sort of thing. Yeah.
But Alyssa and Sarah, do you want to make any final little comments? I think we're sort of running towards the end.
Yeah.
What's your next study for each of you?
Yeah.
I'm involved in a study, not specifically on father-child emotional availability, but actually in a study, an interventional study with children with depression, and we also include fathers in the intervention, and also assess emotional availability. But as we pointed out before, we have we actually get more mothers in the end doing the filming the interaction than fathers. So so I think the point which I would like to make is that we need to include fathers, and there are still a lot of open questions, and we need to focus on these questions and try to answer them.
I have taken a new position fairly recently, so a lot of what I'm doing now is actually focused on the early childhood workforce. But in terms of fathers and executive function, one line I'm trying to pursue is using community resources to help parents learn more about positive parenting, autonomy supportive parenting particularly. And so I've been in contact with our children's museum here, and there's been some discussion about how we could use museum exhibits, or how could we message parents while they're taking children to a place they typically go, so that they could learn more about how what they do in play with children impacts their skills. And of course, no one's going to the Children's Museum right now, but in the normal world, that is something I'm very interested in pursuing.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both for sharing your work with us today. And I think, Campbell, you have some closing.
Yeah, just a couple of comments there. Kevin Nugent saying, great session, thanks very much. And some other very positive responses to all the panelists. Thanks a million. And we won't see 1 million people in Brisbane coming to our Congress, but we hope to have some hundreds on site in Brisbane. But I fear that we won't have many people travelling from overseas, perhaps other than New Zealand. But the WAIMH Congress will be kicking off June 22 this year, and it'll be a hybrid Congress. So we'll have an on-site group, and we're hoping for many people being able to access the Congress, many more than might have been able in ordinary times to come in online. So you'll be able to come in to most of the Congress as delivered live, some of it with people in Brisbane actually talking in a theatre, some of it pre-recorded material that goes live at a particular time. And all of the Congress will be available for at least 6 months afterwards. So unlike our regular Congresses where you're faced with horrible decisions about, will I go to this marvelous presentation or this one, you'll be able to have lots of cake and eat lots of cake at the same time. You can have your cake and eat it too. The people who've put in abstracts, they're all accepted and have been rolled over into this new format. And we will have ways of supporting people to pre-record their own presentations, whether it's a brief oral presentation or part of a symposium. We'll still have our workshops, and we'll have some smaller groups, maybe 20 people, who are able to have conversation with each other in real time with the keynote presenters or the masterclass presenters. So we're looking for a very vibrant and exciting Congress. And what you've seen today in the quality of presentation is exceptional. It's Hiram and Alyssa and Sarah, really thank you very much for bringing so much of the literature, your own research rather, and your own commitment to this area of fathers and infants to our webinar today. And hopefully there'll be these sort of riches available for you in the hybrid online and in face-to-face Congress in June. And Donna has put up the program for the next webinar from next week, and Hi will be in the chair again. Did you want to say anything about next week, Hi?
No, except that it's a full schedule.
Yeah.
Includes some interventions, both psychotherapy and also community-based. So
we look forward to seeing you all again next week, and let your friends know about the webinar next week, and also keep informed about the Congress, and hop onto the website now. There are very detailed explication on how the hybrid model is going to work. So pop on and have a look. And if you happen to be in the vicinity and you're able to stay for a little bit, which might include a bit of quarantine when you get home, you're very welcome to be there in Brisbane. And there's plenty of open spaces to get away from COVID in Australia. Anyway, okay. Thanks very much, everyone. And thanks, Donna, for guiding us through this morning. And a special thanks to Hiram for organising this and your ongoing commitment to research and interventions with dads, fathers with problems, but especially your brilliant skill in drawing people together in publishing, in presenting, mentoring. I can see no end to this skill and facility. 80 years has just provided a stimulus for getting on with more, by the sound of it. Hi. So thanks very much for organising and getting us going today.
thank you, Campbell.